Hey there. I wanted to chat a little bit today about one of the issues regarding how we relate to the divine, and this question of whether we have to embrace everything that a god or goddess represents in order to be closely tied to that deity. What really got me thinking about this was a comment under one of my previous videos by Kelly Bear. Hi there, where she mentioned Lasara Firefox Allen's Jailbreaking the Goddess and the use of a fivefold model of female divinity rather than the more traditional Maiden, Mother, Crone trinity that I had mentioned that I have worked with quite a bit. And although Jailbreaking the Goddess is on my reading list, I haven't actually read it yet. Although I'm interested in hearing Firefox Allen's point of view regarding how this model better embraces and represents modern points of view on what it means to be a woman. Despite not having actually read the book, I am passingly familiar with this fivefold model. It's come up in conversation before. And although I don't really have any interest in debating the relative merits and drawbacks of different models of female divinity, in part because I really genuinely don't think that one is inherently ever going to be better than another. This is definitely, for me, turf where subjectivity is king and it is whatever speaks to you that matters. For me personally, it got me thinking about the fact that I quite like the threefold model. And I quite like this model for a reason that a lot of people don't like it, which is its focus on reproduction, the biocentrism of the model. And I like it despite the fact that I haven't always, nor have I always been able to identify with all the aspects of the Maiden, Mother, Crone trinity. And particularly, the mother was a problem for me because I am a woman who has never had nor will ever have children. Now you can find about 100 videos discussing the mother aspect as the fruition and creative force, the manifestation of projects, intentions, ideas. And by conceptualizing this aspect of the goddess in those terms, you can get around this barrier of not being able to really identify with the concept of motherhood in a literal sense. However, there is an argument to be made that the Maiden, Mother, Crone trifecta still inherently reduces women to their reproductive capacity and elevates that capacity above all the other characteristics that we embody. And certainly that sort of shit is irksome, particularly when it springs from a long and storied history of women basically being reduced to their capacity to breed. And yet I've actually come around to quite enjoy and appreciate that this model of female divinity is broken down into prepartum, parturition, postpartum, and postmenopausal periods. Because you know what? Regardless of whether you have children or not, reproduction is the foundation of everything that we are and have become. Survival and reproduction, the two key drivers of fitness, and the reason for every other attribute we have from an evolutionary standpoint. And in fact, these two main drives, reproduction and survival, I think are both captured in a lot of people's view of the goddess and the god. The god is a figure that is often conceptualized as representing the struggle for survival, and on the reproductive end is essentially a sperm donor. And you see this reflected in his guise as the Lord of the Hunt, the raw animalistic energy and imagery that's evoked by the eater-be-eaten dynamic, whereas the goddess is simplified to a reproductive entity with little concern for her own survival. We are all the latest generation of an ancestry that reaches back to the dawn of life. We are the lineages that survive because our ancestors before us acquired advantages that helped them survive and helped them reproduce. And that's not just running faster or being more weather resistant or being more attractive to the opposite sex. Those advantages that helped us include the capacity to think, the way we think, what we are able to detect, and how we process that information. The abilities we have were nurtured by the need to survive and mate. The things we cannot do are either the roads never historically explored, or the things that conferred no advantage to survival or reproduction. And so from these two core concepts springs everything that we are and have become. survival and reproduction aren't the whole of what we are, but they are the foundation upon which everything else was built. And when I think of these models of deity in those terms, not only do I find no offense in those representations of male and female, but I can embrace them wholeheartedly, not as false equivalencies, but as a springboard for all of the attributes that emerge from those two things. And for me personally, one of the most remarkable things to emerge from this foundation, this core motivation that shapes our interests and drives as a species, is our acquired capacity to choose not to engage in that thing that billions of years of evolution have worked tirelessly to ensure that we do engage in. And one of those choices that defies all of our ancestry is choosing not to have children. Now, to reiterate, like I said before, I am not going to have children. I'm not condemning this decision at all. But I find it amazing that after billions of years and every trick in the book trying to make me an organism that above all else seeks to reproduce, I can then turn around and be like, nah, not for me. And there is an equivalent betrayal, if you want to use the word, of ancestral heritage associated with this male divine concept of survival, and that is the choice not to survive. There are all sorts of means and scenarios in which people defy what should be an inviolable urge to survive, despite it conferring no direct or indirect fitness. So, for instance, indirect fitness would be fighting off an attacker who is threatening your nieces and nephews. Your close genetic association to those children means that you're still acting in a way that increases general fitness, despite the fact that you're sacrificing your life. But people die for principle. People sacrifice themselves for a moral stance without family or relation held in the balance. And it is astounding that we even have the capacity to do such a thing. And I think that this defiance, these places where we deviate from some core concept embodied in a deity, in an archetype that holds sway over most of the world in which we live, isn't a spiritual disadvantage, but potentially an incredibly powerful source from which we can learn more about ourselves and understand ourselves more deeply. Those aspects of you as an individual that fundamentally disagree or oppose some concept held sacred by divinity you work with, I think says a great deal about you. And as is often the case, I think these aspects of self are more readily studied and explored when we have something against which to contrast it. And so although I will never be a mother, through this archetype of the mother, I can look at all of the pieces of me that were designed expressly for the purpose of making me a mother and examine how instead I apportion those skills and energies to my own ends. And in a fundamental sense, the ways in which I violate the expectations of motherhood and the maternal archetype inform my relationship with the Maiden and Crone. The Maiden becomes a representation of all of the behaviors and capacities and all of the processes that serve to maximize her ability to reach reproductive age, to begin reproducing. And in this phase, the Maiden for me taps into some of that energy, that concept of survival that I think is regularly more the domain of the God archetype, and highlights the idea that survival itself, in fact, even that is a secondary concern that exists to further reproduction itself. While the Crone is the application of all of these behaviors, processes, capacities that have now outlived their primary purpose. All of these tools and strengths, having no other raison d'être, are now redirected to anything, any self-centered or self-realizing pursuit. She is what occurs when environmental and historical demands are stripped away. Having said that, I also don't believe that friction between myself and the way I conceptualize certain aspects of divinity is inherently problematic. I don't have to agree with everything my gods embody. I can ignore those aspects of them that I don't like or that don't resonate with me. Or I can engage with them on those aspects that don't resonate with me, and in so doing get a better sense of why they don't resonate. And I can come away still thinking that I'm right on something, but that doesn't mean I can't work with that particular archetype or energy or deity. Perhaps the most important difference for me between deities who are members of a pantheon and the concept of one sole, omniscient, omnipotent God is that members of pantheons are personalities with strengths and flaws, with views that disagree with one another. And so members of a pantheon can work at cross purposes. And most importantly, because they're not supposedly and supposed to be perfect, we can embrace their motivations without necessarily embracing their means. We can agree with them on one issue and the next day become vocal supporters of an opposing camp on another. In other words, we retain our capacity to choose what we believe in, what we want, what outcome we think is best, and are not called to sacrifice our capacity to reason for ourselves in light of the opinion of our deities. And I've been talking primarily about this triple image of the goddess, but this applies very much to other deities. For instance, there's an archetype I work with where I find I very much have to walk that line because their mythology is wrapped up in all sorts of shit that I cannot and will not get behind. But they also embody something I adore and revere. And so aspects of myself work with aspects of that deity, even while I must also guard against and stand strong against those aspects of this archetype that I see as the flaws, the dangers inherent in embracing fully and unthinkingly all that this deity represents. Ultimately, I as a person am a toolbox of skills that have been handed down to me for a particular set of purposes. And among those tools is the capacity to think, imagine, disobey. A final thing I thought was important to mention, because it is something that certainly comes up when we discuss conceptualization of the feminine divine, particularly in this biocentric Maiden Mother Crone model, is issues of heteronormativity and assumed heterosexual relationships, and the applicability of things like presumed reproductive fate for women who are exclusively attracted to women, or more to the point actually, distinctly unattracted to chromosomally male individuals. And on this score, the only thing I really wanted to note was that from the ancestral biocentric point of view that I've been discussing, the reality is that historically speaking, the gender and sexual preferences of women have not been a significant barrier to reproduction. Which is to say, this reproductive fate could be pretty safely universally applied. Because although heterosexual sexual preference is a behavioral strategy to ensure, or rather aid, in increasing the odds of reproduction, it is not equivalent to the drive for reproduction, nor is non-heterosexual preference an insurmountable barrier to reproduction, particularly among humans who, until very recently, from a cultural standpoint, didn't really give a shit what you wanted as a woman, as a sexual partner. It is pretty safe to assume that for a long chunk of human history, women's choices weren't so much between reproducing and not reproducing as they were between volunteering to reproduce or being volunteered to reproduce. And one could make the argument that there is particular relevance and significance to this cultural and evolutionary heritage of reproduction for individuals who not only choose not to reproduce, but whose own sexual preferences, behavioral and cognitive wiring that is supposed to underlie and motivate this act of reproduction deviates from that which encourages reproduction. Anyway. I would, of course, be really interested to hear any of your opinions on the issues I discussed. And until next time, thank you so much for stopping by, and have a wonderful day.